Hey everybody. My name's Ben Sterling, Program Manager for MacIntosh SEED, working together with Squirrel Consulting, AgriUnity, Fort Valley State to speak on the importance of grazing land. With that, I want to introduce Mr. Phillip Brown, who's the Georgia State Grazing Land Specialist for the state of Georgia, and he'll have a presentation talk about the importance of winter grazing, but also be available to answer direct questions about implementation and the importance of doing it now. So,
Thank you, Ben. Very much appreciate the invitation, and I am going to try to share screen here. So with that, we'll kick it off with winter grazing, and I just said considerations and options. I'm sure we won't hit on every option that's out there, but I've tried to get some of the high points and hope y'all will enjoy those. All right. So just as an overview, I'll talk a little bit about why even consider extending the grazing season, why consider winter grazing. Then some of your considerations within that preparation, equipment, and also expectations, I think is important to manage relative to what you're going to get out of that. And then we'll kind of dive through some of the options on cool season annual grasses, the legume options. We'll touch on brassicas, the turnips and radishes, and then just a couple of slides on stockpiled tall fescue. I think there may have been one or two of you from the northern part of the state, and I didn't want to overlook that option. So just to give you an idea in that picture of what you're looking at would be a overseeded Bermuda field. It's got crimson clover and ball clover and a little bit of chicory and a little bit of ryegrass in there. So there are really good options. We have a long growing season in the southeast and can really take advantage of winter grazing and winter annuals more so than probably any other part of the country. So they should not be overlooked at all. So just to go over the considerations for why, at least what comes to my mind initially is, and you get the idea from the dollar bills there rolled up as hay bales, it's cost, right? There's significant cost in either purchasing or certainly producing your own stored feed. It takes quite a bit of time. There's a lot of labor involved. If you're purchasing equipment in particular, a lot of capital investment, and then what I would call sort of quality of life, the frustrations of having to feed on a regular basis. Just the equipment, getting out into the field on a regular basis, often daily or every few days, it does impact the quality of life. There are environmental concerns associated with it. You can see, this feeding location here is just ripe for soil erosion. It's going to set up as a weed issue later in the season. And just the access to the site with equipment or on foot, trying to move something around becomes a problem. So there's a lot of burden in feeding. It doesn't mean that we're going to get away from it, but there are other options, and getting away from these type of things is part of it. The social aspects of just having more time in your day and less frustration around you working for the livestock, in a sense, feeding them instead of letting them feed themselves. So if we put some numbers to it, and I want to note, got up there in the title that these are a little bit older numbers, certainly before the COVID outbreak and pandemic and the inflation that has come along with it. But this is just laid out with number of cows across the top here, your total cost per ton of hay, your total cost per 1,000-pound roll of hay, and then your total cost per cow. And it kind of assumes that you're going to feed over about a 4-month period, and also assumes that you're producing about 6 tons of hay per acre, so that you've got pretty good high rate of production across the acreage that you have there. So let's just pick a 50 head herd, which is kind of about the sweet spot for what I see a lot and work with. Your total cost per cow is around $336 over that 4-month feeding season. and your total cost per 1,000-pound roll is about $84. Y'all may know better of what prices are today, but they're at least that high, and I would say somewhat higher. If we took just your cost per day in hay feeding today is going to be at least $3 a day to feed hay, whereas if you were allowing that animal to collect its own feed, graze its own feed, you're somewhere between 70 cents for stockpiled tall fescue, and then you'll get into the $1.50 or somewhere in that range for the winter annuals. Winter annuals are going to cost more than being able to use any stockpiled forage. So just kind of managing expectations here, I'll give you context on this photo. You're looking at an overseeded Bermuda Bahia pasture. It has not been grazed. You might think that these are areas that have been grazed and the animals have simply rejected, areas around dung and urine spots, and that's not the case. This is just a fertility impact. Mr. Ford mentioned the importance of the soil. We do have expectations for yield when we plant these species, these winter annuals, and if we haven't pulled a soil test and gotten an idea of where our deficiencies are, then our expectations really aren't met if we can't address those deficiencies. And so we can tell from here that there were some deficiencies from a fertility aspect in this field. Where we had nutrients in the form of urine or dung, we got lots of vigorous growth, and where we didn't have those nutrients, we had some issues. So pulling a soil test and applying nutrients as to what's needed, whether that's poultry litter as a nutrient source or whether it's inorganic fertilizers as a nutrient source, they're going to pay off in helping us meet our expectations. So just keep that in mind, that you do want to check where you're at and inventory your resources. Well, other than soil testing, and I'll mention it again right here, make sure you pull a soil test. But what do you kind of need to prepare for to carry out this overseeding effort of getting some of these things in? So one is minimize the residue that you're planting into. I'll go back to this photo right here, and we're not planting into 6 inches of growth in this area, right? We've grazed that down. You can mow it as well, but you don't want to plant into 6 inches or so of standing Bermuda or Bahia. Those winter annual seedlings are not going to be able to compete for sunlight, even if those Bermuda grass leaves have been frosted. They're going to be slower to get going if they've got to reach up and get sunlight, if they can at all. So getting it grazed down and prepared for the seedlings to get sunlight is important. A no-till drill, like you see right here, and are available for rent often from RCNDs or soil and water conservation districts, is going to give you your best seed to soil contact. But a no-till drill is not always available. And what do you do if that's the case? You can broadcast some of these winter annuals. Some of them will broadcast better than others. And in my experience, annual ryegrass and crimson clover probably broadcast the best. There is some increased risk because you're not going to get as good a seed to soil contact. But if you broadcast ahead of that grazing effort that we talked about, then the animals can trample in some of that seed. The tighter density we have on the animals, so the smaller pasture or paddock that they're in when you're trying to get that trampling in effect, helps as well. Your planting season for these winter annuals throughout the state is really going to be September into early November. And September and October tend to be on average, our driest months, but they're also our best months to try to get these species established. So you do have to kind of sit on go, in a sense, waiting for the right conditions to hit for moisture. And oftentimes, and we're in one of those times right now for a good portion of the state, where we're not getting any September, October moisture, and we're just kind of having to wait to see when we can get moisture to get these species established. And that's going to probably be hopefully upcoming. But if it's into early November, if we don't have the season for planting, you don't want to throw those seed out there, particularly broadcast, if we don't have moisture. So some things to think about in working with a no-till drill, particularly if you've rented it. If you look up here, it has not been cleaned out well. This is just a problem waiting to happen, where tubes on the drill are going to get clogged up, seed boxes clogged up. You're not going to get the flow that you want through there. So take time to check out the equipment, whether it's rented or owned. You don't know. Maybe you forgot last year to clean out like you needed. What I've seen is that having a shop vac handy works out quite well to clean out seed boxes, and then just checking these tubes. So it may be seed, or it may be insects, spiders, dirt daubers. Will often get up in those tubes and cause you problems. So making sure that you're, using a wire coat hanger in this instance to try to clean that tube out. The other thing that comes into play sometimes is mixing multiple seed types or inoculating legume seed. We'll talk a little bit more about inoculation, but just a cement mixer can really be handy in mixing seed batches or inoculating seed. Just keeps you from having to worry about it by hand, or try to do so much in the seed box where you don't get as good a mixture or as good an inoculation. And then the other portion of working with the drill is calibration, right? You've got to be able to work through how much seed are you planting per acre. And I've seen it done lots of different ways. And there are folks that are good at really setting up that drill just almost by eye and by feel. I'm not one of those, so I tend to try to carry out calibration, and this Ziploc bag method has typically worked quite well for me. So you detach a few of the tubes, feed them into a Ziploc bag like that. It will hold on with that zip in there. Kind of keep it attached to the tubes, and you just collect the seed that you need. And that was an extra slide that I put in there. You see the shop vac being used to clean out again. And I'll point out too that the University of Georgia put together a pretty good article handout a while back. I think it's still available, Gearing Up for Winter Grazing, and that goes over all the different aspects of a no-till drill for pasture planting. But you can see you can have quite a few tubes that you might have to collect off of. This is feeding off of a small seed box for legumes, and these are going to feed off of the larger seed boxes for your grass species. But back to calibration. So having a scale on hand, being able to measure a distance of where what you're running the drill over, and once you've collected out of those Ziploc bags, you weigh up what you got. Here you see we're checking depth. Most of our species we don't want to plant too deep, right? We don't want to plant too shallow. So our clover species are typically going to be planted no more than about a half inch. Our small grain species will be planted typically anywhere from an inch to a half inch. Annual ryegrass, very popular overseeding species, will be planted around a half inch. So you do have to check depth. There's some technical aspects to set up. So if we don't have a drill available and we've got to broadcast, that's a different story where calibration becomes a little more difficult, and that's a lot more by feel than it is by measurement. But here you see a drag harrow that's being used to get a little more seed to soil contact, so you can broadcast and then run the drag over, or you can broadcast and drag at the same time. But again, you see here, we're not going into a real heavy, dense sod, right, with a lot of residue to shade out any seedlings. So the same thing applies even in that situation. But the drag harrow can be helpful if a drill is not available. One thing that comes up again, what species are better for this? Annual ryegrass, crimson clover are pretty good choices for broadcasting. Small grains, really a little more risk in that there's larger seeded, and just broadcasting them if we can't get good seed to soil contact is going to be a risk. And the other thing that comes up is, well, I can't get the right rate that I want. Broadcasting, I've got to put out more seed than I really want to. So a lot of times you can put in a carrier with that seed. It'll help it flow through the broadcaster, but it will let you fine tune your rate just a little bit more. So let's say you're trying to put out just 10 pounds of crimson clover, but you can't fine tune the broadcaster that well. And so usually something like pelletized lime is a good carrier for any broadcast operation. You put about 3 parts of the carrier, so you would put 3 parts of pelletized lime to 1 part seed. It's going to increase your cost, but it will allow you to stretch your seed a little bit further. Of course, your costs are increased if you're putting out way too much seed too. So sort of a trade-off there. Other carriers that I've seen utilized are sand, and depending on the seed, something like ball clover is so small seeded you could actually seed it with and I've seen it done is broadcast with grits. So it's just a carrier that would allow you to fine tune that broadcast unit a little bit better. What if you did have a drill and you were calibrating? What's the formula for getting that? So you collect your seed, you weigh it in grams in the example of this formula, multiply that across an acre. All right, so 43,560 square feet in an acre. You divide it by 454 times the area that you drilled. So let's say we had a 7-foot drill that we drug at 100 feet. So that's 700 square feet of area that we covered, right? And so we collected 35 grams of seed. And so 35 times 43,560 divided by 454 times 700. And doing that math, we get out that we calibrated for 4.8 pounds per acre. So that's just an example of some of the math there. The 454 and the 43,560 are going to be constants in the formula. You just need to know the square feet of the area that you ran the drill over to run the test, and the grams of seed that you collected. It's always dangerous to do math in these things, I know, but it's something that we do need to talk about in calibration. So what are some of our options? So probably the most popular option, and that's what you see in the background of this photo, is annual ryegrass. It has a long availability typically. Oftentimes you can get a little bit of grazing off of it in the fall, but it's typically more late winter and spring that we get that grazing. If you were planting it alone, this is drilled 20 to 25 pounds per acre is pretty standard. If you were broadcasting it, 25 to 30 pounds per acre. And then if you were putting it into a mixture, say with crimson clover or small grain, then you're looking at more like a 15 to 20 pound rate, broadcast 10 to 15 pound rate if you were drilling. As we've seen multi-species plantings become a little bit more popular, certainly many species in a planting, these mixture rates can even drop down a little bit more. So this would be more like a crimson clover annual ryegrass rate. But let's say we were going to throw rye and daikon radish in with that. I'm definitely at the lower end here, 15, maybe even 10 pounds, the more species you begin to add. So small grains, well, let me go back to annual ryegrass as well and say it's adapted to a pretty wide range of soil conditions. Some of you may be on flatwoods in southeast Georgia, so you've got shallow water tables. You need to think about what species that you're going to be planting, and annual ryegrass would be pretty well adapted to somewhat poorly drained, moderately well drained sites. Small grains, we're talking about wheat, rye, and oats. Planted alone, very standard for somewhere between 90 and 120 pounds, broadcast or drilled. and in a mix broadcast maybe 90, drilled 60 to 70, I would say would be a good option. Oats, see if I've got, let's talk a little bit more about some of the small grains. So all of these photos are of an oat planting. This happens to be a spring oat, which is caught on a little bit more. We can still plant them in the fall, but their reputation is spring oat is that they get going just a little bit quicker. If you've got a forage spring oat, they'll have a lot more leaf width, and that typically translates into forage quality, animal performance. But the spring oats that I'm familiar with are going to have less winter hardiness, and that's the risk that you take on with oats, particularly from central Georgia north. You do have a risk that you'll have winter kill or winter damage, and certainly this past winter, any oats in central Georgia, maybe even a little further south with the cold that we had, did take a hit. And up around Athens, where I'm at, there were certainly winter kill. Oats probably have the most palatability, so animals, livestock are going to typically prefer those. Rye probably has has a little less palatability than any of the other species, but it's still a very good choice. It's hardy. It's going to be fairly tolerant to poor fertility and a fairly wide range of soil conditions. Wheat may not be the highest yielding of the small grains, but it is palatable, and it's going to be more tolerant to wet conditions. So, a somewhat poorly drained soil type versus oats or rye. Now, I don't know how y'all want to handle questions, but if there's a need for anybody to ask a question as we're going along, feel free to ask from my perspective. So other overseeding options then kind of trails on down to legumes, and we talked a little bit about inoculation, and that's simply recognizing that the legume seeds, legumes need a bacteria to be associated with them for them to function and for them to fix nitrogen. Stands that aren't inoculated typically don't perform well, and it's almost impossible, from what I have seen, to get legume seeds that are not pre-inoculated now. So that means that the supplier has put a seed coating on them that includes the inoculant. Usually it's a lime-based coating, so it's a little bit chalky if you want to think of it that way. And it'll have the inoculant in there, and that's good as long as the seed is not too old, and I would classify too old as over a year. Then you would still have to work through the inoculation process. The other thing to keep in mind with legumes is they need good pH levels. So back to our soil test, we want to have a pH typically 6 to 6.5 for forage production and for good legume production. We also want to have good phosphorus and potassium levels in the soil. So on soil test, we want to fall at least into the moderate range on that soil test for phosphate and potash. Kind of the four that come to my mind: crimson clover, airleaf clover, ball clover, red clover. Red clover, even in the coastal plain or the flatwoods, would function a little bit more as it would function as an annual down there, but it's an option. But of the four on this list, it would kind of be the last one I think I would go to, but it's still very useful. So crimson clover, if you've probably definitely seen it roadside, and it's that deep crimson red, and you'll see here in a minute that true red clover is actually a pink bloom, but I don't know how they got that confusion, but it has caused confusion over the years. It's fairly tolerant of soil acidity. You don't want to be much below a 6 from what I've seen, but does not tolerate poor drainage very well. So needs a moderately well drained or better soil type to really flourish, I would say. Its maturity, so if we're thinking about maturity, that's kind of relative to spring. So it's going to be an earlier producer. Late winter and early spring is when it's going to really get going. The further south we are, maybe it might be even December when we can see some good growth on it, depending on when it was planted. It's got good cold tolerance, bloat potential, so that's an issue with gases building up in the rumen of the animal and essentially suffocating. Clovers have that reputation of being able to cause bloat. I would say don't be overly fearful of it. The saying goes, more money's been lost to the fear of bloat than it has been actually lost to bloat. But if it's a concern for you, looking for low bloat or medium bloat, moderate bloat species is worthwhile. And crimson would be a low bloat potential. It really doesn't produce a lot of hard seed, and depending on the year, you can often go back out in June and see some crimson clover germinating in the field. So it can do okay reseeding itself, but it doesn't do great. Again, here's a rate drilled and monoculture, 15 to 20 pounds to the acre. There's a lot of different varieties down here. I almost can only find the Dixie variety as available. If you've got a really good feed and seed or seed dealer that you can deal with, they may be able to find some other varieties, and on occasion we can, working with folks, but those varieties are less available and cost more when you're seeking them out, typically. Arrowleaf clover is another coastal plain and Piedmont choice that works fairly well. It again does prefer a well-drained site, not as tolerant to soil acidity or lower fertility, perhaps as crimson clover would be. It's going to be later in its maturity. So if we think early spring for crimson, arrowleaf clover is going to come on a little bit later than that. And it'll go into May and June in production sometimes. It has a very low bloat potential. It can reseed itself quite well. It has a lot of hard seed, and even in the year that you plant it, sometimes that can be a detriment. Some people will say, I see more arrowleaf clover the second year after I planted than in the first year. So keep that in mind. It can reseed well, but it does have a lot of hard seed often. Low rate on establishment, 5 to 7 pounds per acre, drilled. And Apache is a well-known variety that's available, but there is a newer variety called Black Hawk that has this same virus resistance or better virus resistance than even Apache. So those are available as well. Ball clover is one that I think we don't think about very often. It is in my experience, a really good reseeder. In fact, this stand right here that you see, ball clover, that's all from reseeding itself. It does have a high bloat potential though. So whereas crimson and arrowleaf are low and moderate, this one has a high bloat potential. You can manage that bloat potential by having some hay on hand as they're feeding on these clovers, not turning them in just really hungry, like they've been, on a tight diet before they go into these areas. That is helpful, but just having some hay around while they're on those, they can manage their diet a little bit and go in and get some roughage if the mix of what they're taking in is not quite right. So that can help keeping them off of heavy dews, things like that, and not turning them in hungry. Its maturity is going to be just slightly later than crimson, but very similar. It is really, really tiny seeded, 2 to 3 pounds to acre is a full rate. And depth on it, seeding depth, would be like 1/4 of an inch. if there's anything in the chat, I see something flash up every once in a while, but if y'all interrupt me with any questions in the chat, that'd be fine. I can't see the presentation and manage the chat too well myself.
Oh, we don't have any questions in the chat just yet. But
Okay.
if you do have questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat, or you can ask once Phillip is finished. But you can always put your questions in the chat box.
All right. Appreciate it. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on red clover just because it does function more as an annual in the coastal plain, and it's probably not quite your go-to choice. But red clover is pink in the flowering, and there is a real good variety available now that's called Barduro. It's shown some real promise under irrigation and Tifton. So if that was a consideration, you have that available, maybe that's something you look at. It really does prefer rotational grazing. It does much better on, and all of our forage species do well under rotational grazing, but there's some that need it for sure, and red clover would be one of those. Needs good drainage in the site, and it needs good pH, like pretty much all of our clovers. So I mentioned inoculation in there a couple of times, and that most of your seed is going to come, legume seed is now going to come pre-inoculated. But if you have to inoculate on farm, I'll go back to the cement mixer. Really helps out putting your lot of seed in there. The inoculant comes in a packet like this. Some things to make sure of is that inoculant is in date, that is treated well, hopefully at the feed and seed, that they're not storing it in the window with a lot of sunlight on it, because those are living organisms in there that you've got to put on that seed. And the manufacturer, supplier of the inoculant will give you recommendations for how to work with it, but basically it's just a slurry of the inoculant plus water. So typically with this Endure, it's going to be like 1 bag of inoculant to say 1 cup of water. You get it stirred up, and if you got that cement mixer, you can just kind of pour that in over that raw legume seed. Let the machine do the mixing for you. If you don't have that, then you're talking about mixing things in tubs or trying to do it in the seed box, which just gets a little bit more difficult. Protect that inoculant, like I said. When you get it, don't store it on the on the truck dashboard in the sun. Try to keep it in dry and cool conditions. And typically mixing fertilizers with inoculant is not something that we want to do, because that fertilizer can have a negative effect on those bacteria species in the inoculant. So try to keep that in mind as well.
So
why do the
do you have a
yes,
question in the chat box?
certainly.
Yes, Ms. Holden wants to know, she said, can you speak on the usage of brassicas and alternative seeding in woody areas that may work for both livestock and wildlife?
Certainly, yeah.
She also said, what are your thoughts on clovers in Northwest Georgia area, and it's zone 8B? Right.
So as far as clovers in Northwest Georgia, you've got lots of good options. Everything that we went over right there will be options for you. Ball clover, maybe not so much. That's more of a lower Piedmont and coastal plain. But red clover would definitely be a very good option in Northwest Georgia. That Barduro variety that I mentioned would be great. We'll touch on brassicas here in a minute. I hope I'm not running too far behind here. Maybe I am, but we'll touch on brassicas. Seeding these in wooded areas, that is comes to mind of food plot seedings to me, and those can all be done if we've got not too much of a canopy at all, and typically deciduous woodlands have dropped their leaves, and we shouldn't have terrible cover to not get any sunlight down. So that could be possible. Same thing applies though. If we're talking about woodlands, we need to be able to soil test and treat that soil to get the yield that we want off of these. And sometimes in wooded areas, that's not always possible. And even if we're talking about thin pines, getting pH adjusted can be difficult. And we also want to think about not getting that pH too high so it negatively affect the pine trees. So kind of got to be in there around a 6 at the most in pine stands if timber production is your consideration. So, but we will get to brassicas here in a minute. And if I didn't cover any of that that you wanted from the legume standpoint, let me know. So this is the reason we need to inoculate. These are the nodules on the legume roots that are housing the rhizobium bacteria, and they fix nitrogen for us, so we get free nitrogen from the atmosphere. These numbers are under very perfect conditions, right? How much nitrogen that these can fix per acre. They can fix quite a lot, but these are under perfect conditions. And this would be the value of that nitrogen if nitrogen is selling for about 70 cents a pound. In a grazing scenario, we don't typically get the perfect conditions or these high numbers on nitrogen fixation, just because we're stressing those plants through that grazing process, and they're not going to fix quite as much nitrogen. So just keep that in mind. You're not, the potential is there, but it's in a very low stress situation. Well, in the last clover that I'll speak to, it's not one that we think of much as overseeding, but this will be another great one in Northwest Georgia with our tall fescue pastures. It pairs extremely well. So we don't think of it as overseeding for winter annual grazing. We think of it more as a component with perennial grasses. Not at the highest yielding. It'll yield around maybe 2,000 pounds of dry matter to the acre. It is a perennial species, so in its first year, it doesn't just take off rampantly and provide a lot of grazing. It does tolerate wet conditions. This photo right here is actually taken in Long County, I believe, and so it tolerates somewhat poorly drained soils. And where we've got that moisture in the flatwoods and in the coastal plain on those soil types, that's where white clover can do quite well. But is not going to do well on, say, our sands, troop sands or lakeland sands of the coastal plain. It needs wetter conditions in those areas. Statewide, though, there are a couple of good varieties, Durana and Renovation, and it's seeded at a pretty low rate, 1 to 5 pounds to the acre typically. Pairs extremely well with tall fescue is what you see right here. So drilling it into tall fescue in fall or even in winter can be very successful. Going through some of the different photos there. All right, now we're to brassicas, and it's kind of one of my favorites, really, in a lot of ways. There's a really good fall window for it. That's when it provides its growth is really this time of year. But as I said, September and October tend to be our driest months, so it's a real challenge. Brassicas can provide grazing within 45 to 60 days, typically, of planting. They're seeded at a low rate, 3 to 5 pounds to acre in monoculture. In mixes, 1 to 2 pounds to the acre, typically. Where do they do well? They do well in annual systems. So like if we're using summer annuals, a pearl millet, and then we follow that with brassicas in the fall and winter, that's where they can do quite well, particularly if we're talking about small seeded hybrid turnips. That's where they need to go into, or they need to go into prepared soil. They're so small seeded that they just don't seed into Bermuda or Bahia well at all, and they're not going to seed into fescue either. So this is a hybrid turnip variety right here. This has been put into prepared ground, and you can see some temporary electric fence kind of rationing this out. And in the background, you see a dormant Bahia grass field. And so what's happening here is the producer is just turning these calves in for a very short period of time on these. They're so high quality that the diet, it's too rich of a diet. So they can come in here, get a little bit of feed off of here. But what that feed is supplementing this, what's essentially stockpiled Bahia grass. Timing on planting these is very important. in the coastal plain, it's like right now is about it. The first week of October is kind of my window for getting them in. And in north of there, it's more like mid-September. So after those planting dates, my experience has been that they just do not put on the growth that we would want, and I think it's probably daylight related. So we're getting into shorter days, and they're just not getting enough daylight to put on that growth. So they have a slightly different planting window. They can be planted in August and September, but you get the later you get into September and October, depending on where you're at, the less return you'll get in forage growth. And but they can be quite productive. So this is a seeding of radishes, daikon radishes. That's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 pounds to the acre. And the thing to note about them, if you look down here in the corner, is they pedestal up. That radish grows up, and we refer to that as pedestaling. They can get far bigger than that. But when you turn livestock into those, typically what happens is they're going to break these off. They will eat them, but you're not going to get a lot of regrowth off of that. Okay, once those are broken off. So you're planting these from the standpoint of not quite a one-time grazing, but you'll get a limited grazings off of them. They're generally planted for the aeration of the soil. So this goes down quite deep, gets quite big. So it's a soil improver, more so than it is a grazing crop. This is radishes overseeded into Russell Bermuda grass, and that's at 5 pounds to the acre. They can really dominate at a low rate. So if you were putting these in a mix and you put 5 pounds to the acre, it's just way too much. 1 to 2 pounds to the acre in a mix of these daikon radishes. This gives you an idea of what they can do here in the background when they get more towards maturity, start flowering. This is all still palatable and consumable for livestock. And you can see I think she's getting a radish down right now, but you can kind of see how big these can get and how they break them off and treat them. So it's a more of a almost one-time grazing kind of aspect. We're getting close to the end here. Just for our Northwest Georgia folks, stockpiling tall fescue. It is absolutely the best use of fescue that we have. There are 4 good reasons to have fescue, and it's only adapted to the Piedmont and the mountain regions of Georgia. And those 4 reasons are November, December, January, and February. So the process for stockpiling really begins is carried out in September. You can drop it back into August a little bit, but you really come in, you clip down or uniformly graze that area that you're going to stockpile. You remove livestock. Typically, we would put on 40 to 60 units of nitrogen or a couple of tons of poultry litter for fertilization. There's some data showing that may not always be necessary, and that's tied to organic matter in the soil. So if you got a 3% organic matter or better, you're probably going to cycle enough nitrogen where that fertility is not needed, but you do need the soil test and add organic matter to that test. And what you do when you stockpile, after that fertilization period, you just pull livestock off of it. 60 to 90 days is how long you want to go. Try to get to Thanksgiving is our recommendation. We'll get some moisture somewhere along the way in fall. It may be November before we get it, but fescue will catch up if it's rested and just sitting there waiting for that moisture. It'll get going. And don't turn into it until the first part of December if you can help it. It will really hold up in forage quality quite well. And so the process of rationing out that fescue, and this can be done with the winter annuals as well, but it's called frontal grazing. And the process here is you've got your water facility on one end of the field. You got your cows in there. This would be temporary electric fence right there. And you're just hopscotching that electric fence along. You really, in theory, you're going to have 2 of them. So you're going to take this one down. You're going to have that one up. You're going to take this one down, have that one already up. Cows move forward. They're going to track over this area. Yes, but it's a really good, efficient way to ration that forage out. If you think about how we feed hay, we don't feed hay, we don't just turn them into the hay barn. We put 1 or 2 bales out at a time, or something, how much ever the herd needs. Same thing goes for feeding these crops out. You don't want to put everything on offer in front of them at one time. They're going to waste quite a bit of it. So rationing it out through the use of temporary electric fence is a good technique, and that's kind of what you see in the background here. So this one strand of temporary electric fence is being moved along or taken down. There's another strand back over here off the screen you can't see, and they're just moving ahead into this and frontal grazing it. It's very efficient. No waste right here. You see it's not overgrazed, but there's no waste. The tools for that are temporary electric fencing. That's another talk for another day, but that's what you need to be able to ration this out. This is stockpile tall fescue right here, ungrazed. This is grazed, and that's where the fence was. So you hopefully can kind of see the level of efficiency that you can get through that grazing method. It's very, very, very efficient. So I'll wrap up the winter grazing aspect of this. Is just to say that stockpiling is your least cost option if you have fescue available. You really don't have a lot of equipment needs relative to carrying that out versus winter annual plantings, but I know a lot of you don't have access to fescue. So just in terms of overseeding, be prepared, right? Have the drill available when you need it, hopefully, and make sure that drill's in good condition, and then utilize that forage, whether it's stockpile or whether it's winter annual plantings. Utilize it efficiently, and just preparation again. Soil test. Make sure you know what your expectations are. Get the forage grazed down so that you can get that planting in. Do note that brassicas offer your earliest grazing. Ryegrass and small grains are going to offer high yields as well. Ryegrass and crimson clover broadcast quite well if you don't have access to that drill. So just something to keep in mind. And then with that, Ben said to mention some of the NRCS programs, and I'm glad to do that. It's not my expertise within the agency, but I can lead you through the 5 steps to assistance and talk a little bit about grazing systems in general. But the first step is planning. So, before you do anything, try to sit down with the district conservationist or soil conservationist in your local office, and there's an office that covers every county in the state. What are we going to do, and why are we going to do it, right, is what you're looking at. You'll get recommendations from them. There'll be some exchange back and forth for what you're interested in and how you want to go about things. But it begins with that plan. And if the plan is missing in this process, it really becomes, it's built on a poor foundation. So the second part of that is once you've got that plan, you've decided what you're going to do, why you're going to do it, you can apply for programs, right, that provide cost assistance for various practices that you have developed in the plan. As part of that application process between NRCS and FSA, they're going to determine your eligibility for programs. So that has to do with adjusted gross incomes and things like that. They'll walk you through that paperwork to make sure that you got farm and tract number if you don't already, and that your eligibility is established. At some point during the year, then all of those applications are going to be batched together, right? And there'll be a sign up that occurs as announced. And all of the applications that have been put in since the last ranking period will be batched together, and they'll go through a ranking process. So that ranking process is based on priorities set nationally and within the state. So, what are the conditions on the farm? What are the conditions within the watershed that you reside in? Those are kind of the things that go into ranking. I can't even explain all of the things that go in behind the scenes because I don't know them, and I'm not sure any of us all know them, but they're figuring out where the best use of conservation dollar is thought to be. Once you've, let's say you go through that ranking process and you're selected through that ranking process, then you go through a contracting period, and then from contracting, implementation. So you've got your plan. That plan will be developed over into a contract. You'll understand through the plan, you'll understand what I'm going to do, where I'm going to do it, and you have an understanding of why I'm going to do it. Through the contract, then you'll have, okay, and these are going to be the reimbursement rates for what I do. And you go about implementing that plan and implementing that contract based on the plan that's given to you. So you'll get a plan, say, for putting up fence or for planting annual ryegrass. You implement that plan as it's and that practice as it's laid out in the job sheet or implementation requirement that you get. Once that's done, you contact your office. You can contact them certainly before you do any implementation, just to double check and get any help. But after it's done, you contact them, let them know, hey, I've put up 1,000 feet of fence. Can you come check it out? And that's the implementation process. Once implemented, and as long as that practice meets standard and specifications, then the payment is made for that. But I wanted to focus back a little bit on the plan and whatnot. So the conservation plans and associated practices, they're utilized to address resource concerns. And so we've got some examples in here of what those are. We've got a really good example of soil erosion in a pasture. We've got a really good example of inefficient grazing in this pasture, spot grazing. A really good water quality example right here, where we're feeding hay up above a pond, so we know we're getting nutrient runoff into surface water. And then that's not the best picture, but that's a really good compaction layer in the soil. And those are all some of the resource concerns that we take a look at. And so if you see, aspects like that on your farm, hopefully you don't, but if you do, then you got resource concerns, and you may want to get with district conservationists to see what can be done and drawn up from a planning process.
All right. So Phillip, we do have a question from Mr. Ford. He wants to know, is fescue the only grass that you can stockpile?
It's not. It is probably the best grass that you can stockpile. Some of the other cool season perennials can do okay, but they won't hold up as well as fescue. Brome grass and orchard grass, which are not so prevalent in Georgia, but they will be a little more prevalent as we get further north, certainly in the mountains. They can stockpile okay. You can stockpile warm season grasses, Bermuda grass in particular, but that's another talk for another day too. That there's a lot of detail in making sure you get that one right. So those drop quality significantly. The class of animal that you put on them it basically needs to be dry cows, or you need to be prepared to supplement to that stockpile Bermuda grass. But it can be done in the right situation. I would not take that on if you're not already experienced with stockpiled forages or got a lot of experience with Bermuda grass. So it just be careful with that one. But fescue is the best one to stockpile. Some of the other cool season grasses can stockpile. You can kind of do it with winter annuals. It's not, we don't think of it that way, but you could stockpile early spring growth of annual ryegrass for late season growth, but we don't. It's not. It happens maybe a little bit more by accident than it does intentionally, and it would be a shorter window for that whole process and availability as well. So, where the bulk of the program dollars go with grazing are going to be into what we call facilitating practices. Fence and watering systems are our primary facilitating practices. And so what they facilitate is grazing management, right? So we can control the intensity, the frequency, and the duration of grazing on this field right here, and we can move them over to this field when we've got this grazed down, and we don't come back to this field until it's well rested and back in this type of condition right here. Temporary electric fencing is a really great facilitating practice. It's really low cost, and you get a lot of bang for your buck out of that practice. And then the other more prominent practice within our grazing systems are going to be, watering facilities, pipelines, wells, if they're not available, if there's not an available water source on the property. Because, if we want to achieve a higher level of grazing management, we know that water is the most important nutrient, and we've got to have availability of that to carry out this grazing management. So we do spend a fair bit of time looking at that and trying to get water placed so that we've got good access and availability to carry out, that higher level of management. And the higher the level of management that you want to carry out, the more water you need available to you. And so with that, I'll wrap it up. I did go long, and I apologize. But there's my contact info. I can provide this presentation by PDF to Ben as well. So you would have, links in here to click on. If you need to locate your service center for NRCS, you can click that link right there and find your county and your local office. So with that, I will turn it back over to Ben or Cheryl.
Thank you, Phillip. This has been very informative. This is your opportunity to get your questions answered. So you can just ask your question. You don't have to put it in the chat box at this time.
This is James Ford. I have one. Is there a formula for the number of days that you can rotate versus the number of acres and the forage that you're using? Is there a formula that you can landowner can use to kind of manage that rotational grazing process?
You can get down into the math of that for sure. If you can bear with me for a minute, I might be able to pull up another presentation that might have that in it, and we can look at that formula. But I think what I would say along that is, number one, if we've got a good stocking rate to start with, right? Nothing works, just like nothing works with poor fertility. It's really hard for things to work if we've got overstock conditions. So in general, what I see in the majority of Georgia is with a relatively good level of management. So we're rotating maybe on average once a week or slightly less. We need to be thinking about 2 to 2.5 acres per 1,200 pound cow. And I think that's where we want to be from a stocking rate standpoint to make our rotations work out okay. So if we get into some of the other formulas that can be helpful, but they're guidelines, they're not hard and fast rules. So how many paddocks do I need? And that comes down to a formula that is days of rest divided by days of grazing plus 1. So I'm trying to get up another presentation that I hope will have those formulas in there for you.
Okay.
Bear with me for a second. All right. So number of paddocks is days of rest divided by days of grazing plus 1. So, well, what should the days of rest be? All right. You can kind of pick this on which your forage species are. So Bermuda grass might be around 30 days. Tall fescue would be around 45 days. And it can be influenced by how you want to go about things. So you maybe want to carry out more high density grazing, often called mob grazing now, with long rest periods. And so maybe you want a 60-day rest period. So it's kind of, you pick the days of rest. But for the majority of forages in Georgia, we can hang our hat on 30. And then it comes down to days of grazing. So how long do you, or how often do you want to go out and move animals around? And so in this example, I've said 4 days. I would say that you need to be moving at least every 7 days, but 3 to 4 days would be a lot better. If you can move more often, that's even better. But it becomes more labor intense or time commitment to do that. And if you're full time at grazing operation, you can get those days down to a lot less. But if you're trying to work in town and do this at the same time, then maybe once a week or twice a week is more doable. So 30 divided by 4 plus 1 would tell us that we need about 9 paddocks. But I want you to go back and think to the temporary electric fencing, right? Low cost, a lot of bang for your buck. So, not all of those paddocks, not all 9 of those paddocks need to be permanent. Some of them can be temporary electric fencing, or if you start with 9 as your base, and then you have water that is very well positioned within the system, now I can split that field with a single temporary electric fence line for, if I'm talking cattle anyway, and now I've got the potential with just one split of each field. I've got a potential for 18 paddocks. So more paddocks gives you more flexibility, and it gives you higher stock densities, which tends to lead to better uniform grazing and a lot better nutrient distribution. Now, I think this is probably the formula that you were trying to get into, Mr. Ford, and you can calculate out how much forage is available in a pasture or a paddock, and you can calculate out then, how big does that paddock need to be, how many days might it last. So in this example, we're calculating out paddock size, which is animal weight times their expected dry matter intake in a decimal format, the number of head, the days in that paddock that you anticipate them being in there, how much forage is available, and what level of efficiency do you think that they will attain. So if we had 1,200-pound cows, a constant number that we'll typically use for cattle is going to be 2.6% of their body weight as an intake, times the number of head, times the amount of time we anticipate or think they're going to be in there. We measured 1,500 pounds of forage, and we think they're going to consume about 50% of that. So that gives us a forage demand of 6,240 pounds over that 4-day period, and we have basically a supply of about 750 pounds. So just doing that division would tell us that we need around 8 acres for them in that particular field. So for reversing that a little bit, if we want to leave 50 head for 4 days on a typical stand, then we need to be, or if we've got 8 acres, we can probably leave them there for 50 head there for about 4 days. I don't know if that quite got at what you were thinking, but there is some math you can do. I would say that don't get lost in the math. I've seen this happen to folks a little bit, that we give them a grazing stick or we give them a spreadsheet, and they become very focused on that math, and that's the science part of grazing management, but there's an art to it as well. And the art is observing and watching. And let's just say you were using temporary electric fencing, put a strand up. It doesn't matter how big you make that area, as long as they got access to water and you come back often enough, you'll see when they're done. So let's say you put them in a small area and you just tell yourself, I think this is going to last them 4 days. Well, you come back maybe at a half a day and you look and you observe and you say, whoa, wait a second. This is gone. I made that paddock too small. So then you adjust and you give them a little bit more and you say, well, I still think this will last them another 3 days. and you come back and they still got more, and they've still got more, and they've still got more on day 4. And well, I must have made that paddock a little bit too big. And you go through that process just a few times, really over a 2-week period of adjusting how much forage you're giving them through that temporary electric fencing process. You'll calibrate your eye, and you'll have the art down of sizing those paddocks versus just focusing and getting bogged down in the math. So you can do both, but with a caution that the math is a starter, and the real learning and the real application begins when you trial and error how much you're giving them, and you observe and adjust. So hope that helped.
Yeah. Thank you.
So Phillip, where does a producer begin if they want assistance, like with the math, with the science? Where does a producer begin? Like where should they have that first point of contact to have someone to assist them with like running the numbers?
Right. So a couple of locations that you can go to for some assistance along those lines. Certainly your local service center for NRCS. We've got some of the spreadsheets that can do that. If the field office does not have a grazing stick available, we can definitely get one available to you. I think I shipped a box to Dr. Whitley recently that I think she was going to use for this project. So hopefully y'all will all get one of those. And but the local service center is a great place to start along those lines. And many of your extension agents as well will have access to grazing sticks and these same calculations and formulas they work on from a grazing standpoint, somewhat similar to the way NRCS does. So they're good contacts as well in measuring and allocating forage out. So either of those. We've got a number of publications through NRCS. I've got one that it's called a Guide to Developing a Prescribed Grazing System, and these formulas and calculations and concepts of stocking rate and whatnot are all in those, and I'd be glad to get y'all a copy of those as well.
Okay.
But if you on the ground help, NRCS office, extension, but also, and I assume something y'all will get through this project is, the peer-to-peer learning as well. And so, there are field days that are held where you can come out often and see somebody applying some portion of these techniques, and the ability to hear them discuss what they're doing, how they're doing it, and picking up on how they apply science, but probably more importantly, the art of what they're doing is extremely worthwhile. So watch for some of those opportunities in your area, and I'm sure y'all will facilitate some of those through this project.
Yes. Okay. Do we have any questions for Phillip? Okay. If not, then I'm going to turn it back over to Ben.
Thank you, Ms. Peterson. Phillip, thank you as well. One question that I did have is the importance of rotational grazing. You mentioned that all clovers do better with rotational grazing, and just wanted just a quick insight on why is that?
Yes, certainly. And it's not just all clovers. It's going to be all of our forage species are going to do better. So just think of a leaf as a solar panel, okay? And so to grow or to produce energy, right? That solar panel needs to be able to collect sunlight, and the bigger that solar panel is, the more sunlight it can collect, right? And so if we go in and we just continuously graze a pasture, then those solar panels are getting continuously grazed. They're staying small, and they're not collecting near as much energy as they could. And and so they're not storing that energy in the root systems. The root systems are not vigorous, they're not deep growing. And so through the rotation process, we come in, we trim that solar panel back a little bit, but then we rotate off. We allow that plant to regrow. We allow that solar panel to get big again, collect more energy, push energy back down to the roots, and it's just simply rest, right? We all do better with rest. Me, you, we like to get a little bit of rest somewhere along the way, and the plants are the same way. If they're continuously grazed, they're tired, they're exhausted is a really good way to think of it, and they got no energy to keep putting on growth. Is that a reasonably good analogy, I hope?
Oh yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. I wanted you to just share that insight as far as like the importance of if you're applying this, adding, doing the rotational grazing as well, not doing it all at once. I just wanted you to just elaborate. So no, that's perfect. I want to, as well as Ms. Peterson said, thanks to the Fort Valley State University students that are in attendance. We also have members of the South Georgia Black Cattlemen's Association, and all the producers and growers here. Thank y'all for attending this webinar. Mr. Phillip, thank you again for just sharing your insight and knowledge and expertise on the importance of this time right now as far as the winter grazing. And with that, I think we will end the webinar. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much.